Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Katie Stilp. I'm the local history librarian at Appleton Public Library, and this is our genealogy session. We're both live at Thompson Center with a bunch of in-person attendees, and we've got some virtual folks joining us from around the United States as well. So I'm going to get us pulled up here, and we'll get started. So today we're talking about vital records. I need to hide this here. All right. So just a reminder, if you did miss our first session, so we started this last month where we talked about getting started in genealogy. If you did miss that first session, it's okay. You'll still be able to figure out what's going on today. You you need to know that information, but you don't need to know it in order to learn stuff today. If you did miss that session or miss part of it, we did record it and it is on our YouTube channel. So youtube.com/APLREF. I created a whole playlist where I post these videos on there. So just like today's session, I am recording and we'll have that video on there probably later tonight. So if you need me to do a demonstration later, I can show you how to find that again to be able to watch those videos. So if you do need to leave early today, you're welcome to catch the recording, even if you're joining us in person, because this is a jam-packed session, just like it was last month. So I might go a little over that hour and a half like I usually do. Also, for our in-person attendees, there's going to be a change to the handouts next month. So unfortunately, just because how big the class has gotten and how long the handouts are, we can't afford to keep printing them for everybody. So what we're going to do next month is we're going to email them to people, and then you guys can print them out at home, or if you have an iPad or a laptop that you just want to have that handout on and bring it to class with you, you're welcome to. If you don't have a printer, of course, you can come at Thompson Center to get that handout printed, or come to the library to get it printed. If you can't afford to get it printed through one of those places, because it is 15 cents a page to come print it at the library, come and talk to me. We can definitely print a few handouts out for people who, money is an issue or they don't have a printer. So just be sure to talk to me. But starting next month, we're going to start that where everybody's going to kind of have to print their own handout, unfortunately. Otherwise, I would have to cut down the handout a lot. And I know that's going to be a problem because our handouts are so detailed. So hopefully everyone's okay with that. If you have questions, just let me know. And like I said, today we are talking about vital records. For our online attendees, if you have any questions during today's session, feel free to type those in the chat box or the Q&A box, or look through that periodically. But right now, as I'm presenting, I can't see that box. Any person in person, you can feel free to raise your hand and stop me. But I do have a couple points throughout our presentation today where I check and see if there's questions. But of course, anytime, feel free to interrupt. So hopefully you might know what vital records are off the top of your head, but if not, vital records stand for birth, marriage, death, and divorce. So these are the vital events in your life. Obviously, everybody's born, most people get married or divorced, and then everybody dies, of course. So these are vital records for vital events in our life. You might be wondering, well, why do I need to research vital records? Well, of course, vital records are going to be some of the best sources in genealogy because they're going to be original sources with primary information, and they're going to provide direct evidence. And if that kind of is like, okay, I have no clue what you mean by that, refer to our handout in our session from last month where we talked about the different types of sources, the different types of information, and different types of evidence. And that will make a little bit more sense then. Vital records also prove relationships between people. So they're usually going to list a person's name, of course, that record about who it's about. It's going to have an important event, their birth, their marriage, their death. And it's usually going to list their parents' names. So that's going to prove that relationship between that child and those parents. Or it might list the spouse, or in addition, it might list the spouse or some other relative, depending on what record type it is and who's filling out that information. So we'll dive deeper into each of the different types today. So this will make sense a little bit more as we go on today. Of course, in our genealogy research, we're going to need names, we're going to need time periods, we're going to need locations in which our ancestors lived in order to do our genealogy research. Otherwise, we're looking for that needle in the haystack if we don't have that information. So vital records and research in them, that's going to help provide those clues. It's going to help provide answers to point us in the right direction of where we're going to start that research. They also are going to help us fill in our blanks. So last month we talked all about our pedigree charts and our family group sheets and how, we might have blanks in those spots because they're asking for a person's birth date, birthplace, marriage date, marriage place, death date, and death place. So if we have blanks on those charts, well, our vital records are going to help fill in those blanks. And again, if you missed last month's session, definitely check out that recording on our YouTube channel. And if you need a copy of the handout, feel free to reach out to me. So just broadly, I'm going to talk about kind of how to research vital records. And then, like I said, we'll go a little bit more in depth into each of them. And I'll give you lots of examples of what they all look like. So essentially, each state in the United States and each country have different dates on when they started legally requiring vital records. And even then, even when it was legally required, not everybody 100% complied, even years later. And you also still might find vital records even before it was legally required. So just because, for example, Wisconsin began in 1907, they have marriage dates way before then. They have marriage dates recorded in their legal records prior to all the way up to 1820, which was prior to statehood. So Wisconsin didn't become a state until 1848, but they have marriage records dating back to 1820. So it's not going to be every single marriage that happened, of course, but it is going to be, some spotty coverage. You might get lucky and find your ancestor in those records. So I always encourage you to check, even if it's, a far away date from when they legally required. Yeah.
So would they show other states' marriage license? In other words, you're married in another state?
Yeah, so just a second, I will tell you where to go to find out what date started wherever you're researching. Yeah. So again, always be sure to check no matter what the date is, because you might get lucky and find your ancestor, and hopefully it'll be a nice detailed record with lots of information and lots of clues for you. Even if you don't find a vital record though, there's going to be alternative records, and I'll give you a couple of those in each of the little sections that we talk about each of the different records. But the main one is going to be a church record. So for example, if you don't find a death record or a birth record for your ancestor, maybe they recorded it in the church that they attended, that they were baptized, or because they were buried in the cemetery that's affiliated with the church, they might have a couple lines on your ancestor's death that's it's proving that that event happened and what date and all that fine kind of information that you're going to need to fill in your blanks. Be aware that foreign countries, we're not going to talk too much about international vital records, but they do sometimes call it civil registration. So be sure if you're looking for international vital records that you use that terminology, because sometimes it auto-corrects it, but sometimes if it's a little easier to find out that date and time period and all the records available if you use that phrase. So to answer the question, to learn when a vital record began in a specific location, I recommend starting with what's called the Family Search Wiki, which is this awesome site through Family Search, which is one of the main genealogy sites. It's a completely free site. So it's a link in your handout. So this is what the Family Search Wiki looks like. And what you can do is you can search a different place or a different topic or both. So what I can do is right here in this little search bar, I can type in Wisconsin vital records. And I can hit the little magnifying glass. And it's going to bring me to a page all about Wisconsin vital records. And you can see right here, it talks about when the earliest was, when statewide registration happened. And then down here, it even gives a general compliance. So when it's saying almost 100% of people were complying with this rule, that's 10 years after it was legally required. So there might be some spotty coverage between that 10-year period where even though you anticipate finding your ancestor in there, you might unfortunately not get a record for them. But you can do this for any state in the United States. You could also do it for any country. So for example, my German ancestors, I could look up Germany, and I again want to put in civil registration since that's their terminology. And then I get a page just like that Wisconsin one, where it's going to talk to me about how to research in this area, because there's different, rulings and different boundary changes and stuff. It talks about those years when it happened in the different regions of what became Germany. So you kind of need to read through this a little bit more to learn a little bit more about how to research in that given area But this will be kind of the starting point for the majority of your research, especially if you're not familiar with how to research in a given area. This is going to give you the basic information because it's going to vary state to state. It's going to vary country to country. That makes sense?
Yeah, okay, like take Oklahoma, which was a territory
Yep.
before, will it do a similar thing like it
Yeah,
did with
so,
Germany?
yep, you type in that location, so Oklahoma, vital records. And you can see, it's gonna have a similar table, just like we saw on the Wisconsin one. And it's gonna, actually even give you links to researching that location. So if there's certain things that are digitized online anywhere, it's gonna provide you links. And if you dive a little deeper, it'll tell you where exactly you would have to go if it's not online. You had a question back there, or did I answer it?
I had a question, but I think my dementia kicked in.
Well, if you think of it, just bother me again. So that's kind of my go-to starting spot, no matter what I'm researching, even outside of vital records. I always start with Family Search Wiki. You hear me in a lot of our sessions talk about Family Search Wiki. So if you don't know that yet, you're gonna learn it. Yes.
So that company Ancestry that you see advertised, they probably get a lot of the same information off the internet, right? So they're just condensing it. But
Yeah, so Family Search Wiki will link to things that are on Ancestry. Yep.
So we could pay you to do our ancestry, right?
Unfortunately, you cannot. I'm not available for hire, unfortunately. So in order to start your search for vital records, of course, after you go to that Family Search Wiki, you're still going to need some information, right? You're still going to need a name of your ancestor. You're still going to need a geographic location. You're still going to need a date or a date range to find a record for somebody, or you're going to be searching for a really long time. So what I always recommend is you start with stuff that you know first, and then that's going to help you move to the unknowns. So you're going to look at yourself. Hopefully you know when you were born or when you were married, or obviously you haven't died yet. But you're going to look at your parents then, when they were married, when they were born, when they died, if they're, still not with us, your grandparents, etc. So you're going to look for all those birth, marriage, deaths, and divorce records for all those people. If you know those exact dates and locations, you're going to find those actual original records for each event, for each person. And that's going to give you clues to the unknown generations to help you find more about those people that you don't know yet. So kind of think to yourself, okay, where's the spot where I need more information? So for example, maybe I don't know when and where my paternal grandfather was born. So where could I look to find this information if I don't know that information and I can't readily ask somebody in the family who might know that information? Well, I could first look for clues in the vital records of my father. If my father's got any siblings, which he does, I can look in their vital records for clues. I could look in clues in my grandfather's death record or an obituary. Hopefully it would list his birth date and birth location. I could look for clues in the marriage record of my grandparents. Maybe it's going to list what age he was or where he was born. Those are going to give me clues. I could look for clues in the census records, which is all we're going to talk about next month, all about census records. So maybe at that point, you kind of have gathered enough clues to at least lead you to a specific place and a specific time period to look for an actual birth record for your grandfather to answer those questions. Or maybe you still need to do a little bit more research, and that will come kind of, you're going to come to a point where it's going to be harder and harder to find vital records for people. So you might need to do a little bit more outside research or more digging to find these clues and try to piece together the puzzle. But once you do find that birth record for your grandfather, well, guess what's on that record or should be on that record besides that date and location of when he was born? It's going to have the name of his parents, who maybe you don't know their names. Well, now you have another generation to explore and start the process all over again, where you're looking for those clues, finding records, looking for clues, finding records, and you kind of continue that process generation by generation.
Good question.
Sure.
You said on your death record, it's showing your parents?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So we're dive deeper into death records and I'll show you some examples and what you can anticipate finding on those types of records. Yep. Sometimes you get really, really detailed, direct information in vital records. So, for example, it could say the mother of Ralph Hamilton was Abigail Hand, born in Elmwood, Illinois. She was 29 in 1909. So I could do the math in my head or use the calculator and figure out she was born about 1880. So I've got, information from my great-grandfather's birth record that then could lead me to a birth record for his mom, if one exists, because now I have her maiden name, I have an approximate year of when she was born, and I have a location. So those are the three key pieces I need in order to try to find a record. At the very least, it gives me her name, including her maiden name, and that potential location and time period of when and where she was born. So I can dig for more clues or find alternative records if I can't find an actual birth record for her. Sometimes, unfortunately, the information on a vital record is a little bit more vague. It's indirect evidence. And again, if that kind of terminology doesn't make sense to you, refer back to our handout in our session from last month where I dive deeper into what direct and indirect evidence is and all that stuff. So if you have indirect evidence or the information is not very clear, you're going to need to investigate more and try to find more records to try and pinpoint a more precise location, a name, or especially the maiden name of a woman. Sometimes that's not always listed on a record, and or a date. You might not get an exact date. Like for example, when I talked about finding that great-great-grandmother, I had to calculate what approximate year she was born in. She could have been born a year before or a year after or 5 years before or 5 years after. It's kind of a guess at that point, but it's giving me at least a time range to start with. So even if the records that you find don't have that concrete direct evidence, so for example, maybe you get Illinois and not an exact city or county in Illinois, well, consider looking into a place where you already maybe know your ancestors were in that state. So for example, your great-grandfather was born in Peoria County. Well, maybe his parents were also married there. And maybe they were born there too, because people didn't move around as much during these times. Or maybe there's some sort of statewide index of their birth, marriage, and death records that I can search online easily to see if I'm able to find the names of my ancestors. Or maybe there's some other alternative records that I could search for that's going to give me some more information that will help me be able to pinpoint more on my family. And of course, I always want to encourage you to remember to always follow up and get the actual original record, not just rely on the index. And I'll show you a little later a great example of an index and what is actually on the record, because you're going to be amazed at the little bit of information you get on an index and all the awesome information you get on the actual record. So there's always going to be additional information on the actual record. So the record, of course, may not exist for a time or a place you're looking for, or maybe somewhere else. Maybe you were given one clue and it's not right. So you're going to need to explore and continue looking for clues, continue looking for alternative records, and keep trying to piece together the puzzles of your family tree. Sometimes it's really easy and you're like, hey, this is awesome. Other times you are banging your head against the desk, like, I cannot find this record. They're supposed to be there, or I don't know where else to turn. So that's sometimes the joy of researching genealogy, is sometimes it's a little hard of a puzzle, just like a regular puzzle, putting together the pieces. Sometimes you get easy ones, sometimes you get those hard ones. So don't give up. It does tend to be easier to start with someone's death record or obituary and kind of work backwards to their birth information, because a death record and obituary, those might give you clues about their birth date, their location, their parents, spouse, marriage date. Whereas, of course, if you find a birth record first, that's not going to give you clues on when they died or who they married or where. So you kind of start with their last known record, which is going to be their death record and obituary, and try to work back to construct their life, essentially. Remember, though, unfortunately, on our death record, in our obituary, our tombstone, that information is all given by somebody else, because obviously we can't provide that information on ourselves. So that information might not be 100% correct. It's going to be at least a clue to get you to a possible starting point. It really is going to depend on who's providing that information and their relationship to that person who died. Even people who are closely related might get that information wrong. Maybe they misremember it, or accidentally get it wrong. So maybe they misspelled the maiden name of a mother, or maybe they thought the person was born in one location and they were actually born in a completely different location. It happens, you know, obviously we've all had to deal with losing a loved one. You kind of at that time, you're probably in shock a little bit, and you know, whoever is giving that information, just, you know, sometimes it happens, we misremember things. And we're dive a little deeper into, again, what you can find on each record and all that fun stuff in just a little while. I always also find it helpful to create a chronological timeline of a person's life. So as I'm starting to research a person, I start making a timeline. So you can either do this if you have genealogy software, you can do it right in your software. You can create a spreadsheet or some sort of document on the computer, or write it in a notebook, whatever is going to be the easiest and most logical for you. So kind of whenever you find a source for that person, you're going to plug that information into your timeline. So you're going to plug in when that event happened, so a date as complete as possible, where that location is as specific as possible, if it's the city or the county, or you just have a state, and then what that event was. So for example, I've got an example timeline here for you. On one of my ancestors, I have his death record on this date in this location. I also then found him in the 1920 census in that location and when it was enumerated. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about the census next month. I found a newspaper mention in a specific location on a specific date. I found him in the 1910 census. So all this information I'm putting into a timeline to construct where he was at what time period he was there. And that's going to help me try to find out more information about him as I'm diving deeper into the different record types in genealogy. You can also create timelines online. So Family Search has a family tree integrated into their site. And Ancestry also has a family tree, of course, integrated into their site, where they each have timelines that you can build into each person. So Family Search, anybody, anywhere can log into this and create information or change information on your given ancestor. So just be aware of that. But right here, you see each person kind of has their own page. I'm just showing you quickly what it looks like, not showing you how to navigate there because we already are going to be tight on time. But you can see there's a little timeline tab here where I can see, here's a little timeline. I can see where he was married, when his child was born, residence, all this stuff that people have put on here. So again, I'm going to use this information kind of with a little grain of salt. I'm going to use it as a clue and try to find an actual record if I don't have an actual record here. I can also check the sources here to see if there's actual records that would help me verify any of this information. But this is kind of what their timeline looks like on Family Search. And then they have a very similar looking timeline on Ancestry. So I personally built my own ancestry tree. And then you can see, just like on Family Search, I've got a timeline here where it shows, you know, when he was born, where he was living, all that kind of stuff. Some of the stuff Ancestry automatically populates. Some of it you have to attach records and then it will kind of extract that information. As you're attaching a census record, for example, it's going to put in that date and that location there. So again, you can create your own timeline or use these already kind of pre-made timelines that you can add things to. Yeah.
So knowing Ancestry as a company, is that free to do it that way, or is it?
So you can build your tree for free on Ancestry, but in order to attach records and view the records, you'd have to pay for a subscription.
How much is it?
It's going to vary depending on if you're accessing US only records or world records and what time period. They do run occasional deals on it, but it's not cheap, unfortunately. So we do have the library edition that you can access records for free. You just can't build your family tree in the library edition. You'd have to, you know, use a separate free version of Ancestry to build your tree.
Most of my ancestors have been from like Ukraine up to Germany. How do you get that far into it? Or don't you?
So eventually you get to where you need to find information across the pond or outside of the United States. And we will have a whole session on international records. But essentially what I would do is once you get to that point, I would start with that Family Search Wiki, like I showed you a few minutes ago, where you type in Ireland civil registration. It's going to tell you, okay, this is the time periods where they started that. This is how I might be able to access them online or offline. So again, you want to use these family trees that you might find for clues. Even if you don't build your own ancestry tree, other people, cousins and things might have built trees on there that you could look for their trees, look for clues to then pinpoint you like, okay, this is the time period, this is the location I need to look in, and follow up to actually find sources for that. Don't just, copy and paste their stuff and believe it's 100% true, because it's not always 100% true. Vital records are also going to look different and may include different amounts of information depending on what location it is and what time period you're searching. So for example, a Wisconsin 1905 birth record is going to look completely different than a 1950 Wisconsin birth record. An Illinois death record is going to look different than a Michigan death record or a Germany death record. So all the fields that, they might have on these records might not be filled in. Sometimes you might get unknown listed there, or it might be blank. Unfortunately, that happens. Sometimes you just need to, look at what information you're given and try to make sense of it, or try to find alternative things to help pinpoint more information. So, it might ask for the parents' names on a marriage record, but maybe it's blank for the bride, or maybe it doesn't include the maiden name of a mother. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's not always guaranteed to get that information on there. Spelling also isn't accurate, or a person recording that information might have misheard that information and spelt it how it sounded. So always definitely look up alternative spellings in an index, either online or in person, to try to catch any of those errors or misspellings. So for example, one of the surnames is Kohlberg in my family. So I've seen it with a K, with a C, with a U in the Berg, or with an E in the Berg. I've seen it with an H in there. I've seen it as Kolbeck. So I've seen it even more ways than just these few that I've listed. So it's fun, and you kind of think, oh, it's probably not the right person then, but eventually you're going to see misspellings. It's going to happen more frequently than you think. I also recommend just browsing the records during a time period that you think your ancestor is going to be there, to make sure that you don't accidentally overlook them. The bonus for that is that you might find additional siblings or other relatives that you didn't know about. Of course, if you're looking in a big city like Chicago, or you've got a really common surname like Johnson, that's going to be a lot of work and a lot of extra time. So hopefully, you're see how beneficial it is with some of those more unique surnames that you have, or in those smaller locations where your ancestors might have lived for a long time. But I always kind of browse through certain time periods and certain surnames. I also, like I showed with the misspellings, a K versus a C, or, I've seen K's mistaken for S's and S's mistaken for K's. So always to kind of do that extra step of looking in that time period and looking through all the letters of the alphabet that you think that person might be under, even if it's not the actual letter that their last name starts with. You might get lucky. Also, remember, not everything's online, unfortunately. As much as is online and has continued to come online, doesn't mean it doesn't exist if you can't find it online. You may have to visit somewhere offline to look at a record. You may have to request and pay for a record if you can't go visit there, or it doesn't make sense for you to visit there. Maybe you could request it through postal mail, or hire a researcher in that area to look at it and get the record for you. It really depends on what your needs are. It's of course not always cheap. You kind of do it a few at a time as you can afford them, prioritizing the ones that you want first, and looking for alternative records in the meantime. So, obviously in Wisconsin, it's about $20 each record. So that adds up really quick. If you're looking for 100 people, that's a lot of money. You can quickly burn through your whole budget just on genealogy records. So of course, try to find what you can in the meantime without having to spend that money to get that record. Or I'm going to show you in the handout at the end, I have some tips on researching Wisconsin, because Wisconsin's an awesome one where you can just go to the Register of Deeds office, or make a trip to Madison if you don't want to go to 10 different Register of Deeds office around the state. If you have lots of Wisconsin people who died, go to Madison. They have a vital records office where you can look at the records for free. You wouldn't be able to get a copy of the records unless you paid the $20 for each of them, but you can at least write down in a notebook what that information is on those records without having to pay for them. So that's a cheap way to get genealogy done.
Couldn't you just take your phone, and take a picture of the record?
It is illegal. You will get kicked out right away and fined heavily. Yep, you cannot just take a picture of it with your phone, unfortunately.
If I do it for everybody, I just get kicked out once, right?
Yeah, good luck. Try it and let us know how it goes.
We'll visit you.
You're saying that Madison has records of everything in Wisconsin?
Yes. Mhm. Of course, yep, go ahead.
What is the office called?
It's
that
called the
would be-
State Vital Records Office.
State Vi- Okay, so mine would be Minnesota, so I should find something under state vital records.
So I'm not sure if it's the same for the other states. I just know for sure Wisconsin. If you're looking for Minnesota or a different state, definitely start with that Family Search Wiki. Many states have a statewide office. Some of them might not cover all of the state records though. Each state handles it differently, unfortunately. They can't just make it easy for us. Also, of course, if you're going to write and pay for a record, make sure you're writing and paying to the right place because you don't get a refund. Or make sure your information's pretty solid and that you are pretty confident that a record exists in that location because you don't get a refund if they don't find a record. Even last year, I've been doing this almost 20 years and I wrote to the wrong place in Illinois last year and I lost the $18. I had to write to the right place again and then pay $18 again, unfortunately. So it's not a cheap mistake sometimes, depending on what place you're writing to and how much their fee is, because each state is different what their fee is. Some of them are kind of reasonable, some of them are outrageous. Don't, of course, just stop at getting the vital record, or if you can't find or pay for a vital record, you also want to look for a church record. And we're going to talk all about church records more in depth in August, which I know is a long ways away, but it'll be here before we know it. But church records can contain additional details that you might not find in a vital record filed with the state or with the county. So maybe you get that actual town name in Germany where your ancestors are from, which is vital information that you need in order to find your ancestors in Germany. Otherwise, you're looking for that needle in a haystack again.
You pay for those? Just church charge also?
Churches typically don't charge you, and you can take a picture with your phone or your camera, depending on the church. Some might say, hey, it'd be great if you could give us a donation. But most of the time I've never come across one that has said, you have to give us a donation or you have to pay for you to come in to research our records. Yes,
Well, Germany, you have to be careful because a lot of places were destroyed during the war.
yes.
And I had relatives that went to Germany and they were lucky, like, second great grandfather's records were all there.
Yeah. That's going to be the case for other places too. You know, unfortunately, courthouses burned, you know, devastations happened, floods happened, fires happened, all kinds of things happened, wars happened. So it's going to vary every location that you're looking for depending on the time period. So that's why I always encourage you to start with the Family Search Wiki in a location to learn the most of what's available, where it's available. Also, of course, boundaries change. So my next tip is to check the parent counties or the surrounding counties. So a parent county is what it was called before it became that county. So for example, Outagamie County didn't exist at a certain time. Before that, the parent county was Brown County, which is to the north of us. So you want to be aware of those boundaries and name changes. A really great free resource for any of us Wisconsin residents is through Heritage Quest, which is one of our library's databases, and they have a census map guide. There's also, you know, your local library, if you don't live in Wisconsin or are visiting somewhere outside of Wisconsin, they might have access to the database. Or there's this really great book by William Dollarhide and William Thorndale, all about census maps that show you the exact same stuff that's on Heritage Quest. But I'm going to show you quickly what it looks like. So to get there, you're going to start at apl.org. You're going to click on eLibrary. This is going to give us an A to Z listing, or I can narrow it down to genealogy right here, right away, just to kind of not have to wade through it all. And then right here where it says Heritage Quest Online, that's how I get into the database. And then from here, it's really, really simple. They have where it says Census Map Guide. That's what you're looking for. So this is a whole map of the United States. So I would pick whatever state I wanted to look at. So say I want to look at Wisconsin. Then it's going to show me over here on the left side, you can see all these different years that the census was taken. Where you see it in black, so this is Wisconsin in 1820, there's only 2 counties, because Wisconsin's actually a territory at this point, it's not a state at this point. But then you can see in the white behind it, that's what the current boundaries are. So you could change the date over here if I want to say, oh, my ancestors came in 1880, what does the state look like in 1880? And now I can see, look at how big Oconto County is, and Langlade, and Lincoln County, you know, whereas years later, then they were broken up into smaller counties, for example. So you might have ancestors in Oneida County and you're like, okay, I can't find Oneida County records in 1880. That's because it didn't exist at that point. It was part of Lincoln County. So this is going to be really helpful for you, especially the further back in time you're going. And again, this is for every state that you can click on this map. Or again, they have the book. I think I wrote the complete title of the book in your handout, where you could also check out the book if you're not somebody who's very computer savvy. We have the book at the library you can check out, and it has those exact maps in that book.
We can access Appleton's library website from home, can't we?
Yes, yep.
And
So
you could still get.
you can
this
access that
home,
from home, absolutely. Mhm.
But it says free for Wisconsin.
Yes, you have to be in Wisconsin. If you go summer or winter in Florida, unless Florida has the same kind of similar agreement where they allow any Florida resident to access it, you would have to go through like a Florida library site then. Because it's not going to work if you try to go through our library site if you're outside of the boundaries of Wisconsin.
Okay.
It's funny like that. It all has to do with money, of course. Of course, the further back you go, the less detailed records are going to be, unfortunately. The less likely you are going to be to find a vital record for everybody because they just weren't legally required at a certain time period. But again, it's going to depend on that geographic location every single time. So I'm going to check in with our virtual folks, see what kind of questions we've got here. Someone says Wolfram Alpha is a site that can calculate dates when you get something like 79 years, 3 months, 26 days on a tombstone. So they do have some age calculators, which is really helpful if you don't want to do the math in your head, or you get something very specific that it gives you the month and the date. Without making your brain hurt, you can easily Google a calculator. So thank you. See what kind of chat stuff's in here. Hello, everyone. Let's see. Chances of vital records for births in 1805 in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is one of the earlier states that have vital records. So again, I would start with that Family Search Wiki to see especially where in Pennsylvania you're looking to see what's available. Someone says, yes, you can get Ancestry for 30% off through AARP for discounts. So you can look into that. There is a handout. Pop that in there again for you guys. Military members can get free home access to Ancestry, I've heard. So you have to check into that. I've not personally heard that as well. All right, any questions you guys have before we move on to diving deeper into each of the records? Yes.
How really correct is the study?
The vital records? It's going to depend. Every record you have to look at with a critical eye and determine where the information came from and use other sources that you find to kind of look at all the evidence that you have on that given fact and see what's going to be the most correct. Yeah, unfortunately, there's no guarantee that everything's 100% correct, and I know everything's not 100% correct. Yeah. Yeah, well, and you know, people mistype stuff too. It happens, or like I said, you know, you can misremember or misspell somebody's name or birth location or the age. Like if you ask me what my age is right now, I have to do the math in my head. Like that's, you know, you get to a certain point and it's like, you know, before I could rattle off, oh, I'm 21 or oh, I'm 30. Like now I have to do the math in my head. So if you were asking me as a census taker and coming to my house, I would have to sit there for a minute before I gave you an answer. Or maybe I'm answering for my husband or my kids, and I've got to try to figure out, okay, who was born when and where. That's a lot of information to try to remember. So mistakes happen. Yeah.
Do you find certain states to be like more up to date and more accurate? I mean, like first comes to my mind is Tennessee. You think of all the hillbillies, So maybe their records aren't as maybe complete as they are.
Yeah, so more rural locations sometimes are a little, less complete because of course people had to travel a distance to report that information. Or like if a midwife was, reporting that information for them, she's gonna write down a bunch of them before she goes to the county courthouse to record that information. So a lot of time period might have passed between that happening. Or she might have written down the information wrong, or whoever was telling her that information had it wrong. There's so many different spots in the reporting of things that information can get wrong. So, or even people index things wrong. I'm going to show you an example later. So, of somebody indexing something wrong. So, always look at everything that you find in a record with a critical eye and find other information, other sources to back up each of those facts that you find. Yeah.
Maybe it's a silly question, but as we're doing all this, do we want to have a copy of those records or just use them as citations?
So it's up to you and kind of your budget. Like I said, Wisconsin is $20. I personally don't have $20 for each person to order all those different records for each person, especially when you're researching siblings of your ancestors. So for some people, it might be, okay, I'm going to buy the direct line people, like my grandparents, my great grandparents, and those things, or maybe the states that have them cheaper, it's more beneficial for you to have a copy of it. Or, hey, I can't hop on a plane to go to California just to get one record. It makes more sense for me to order it or get somebody to order it for me, or get a researcher to look at it for me. So you kind of have to look at your own situation, your own budget, your own willingness to travel or to hire somebody. And I kind of get into that a little bit later too as well. So I kind of give you some ideas of things that you can do, because of course it's not feasible for all of us to do all of that. All right, so now we're going to dive deeper into each of the individual records. I'm going to show you some examples and show you what information you find on each of these records. So first, of course, we're going to start with birth records. So here's an example of a 1905 Wisconsin birth record that I found on my great grandmother. It's going to give information like her name, color, sex. Wisconsin's awesome in this time period, and then it gives the names of her siblings. So now I've got names of her siblings that were born before her. So I know I'm not missing any extra kids that they might have had before her. Of course, there were other kids who came after her. Got the name of the father, his occupation, the full and maiden name of the mother, the date of birth of the child, the place of birth. I've even got an exact time, 11:30 in the morning, and what day of the week it was. I've got a birthplace of a father. Unfortunately, it just says Germany, but I'm going to find some other records and find out exactly where in Germany. The birthplace of the mother, again, is just Wisconsin. So you got to find some more records to get more detailed location. I've got who was the attendant signing the certificate, where that person lived, what the date of that certificate was, the name of the health officer or clerk who took this information, where they lived, what date it was registered, and then they have a spot for any additional information. So sometimes they put additional notes or things in there, like this person was a twin, or something. I've seen other little random notes here. And I found this on Ancestry Library Edition. So again, you can come to the library and look at these records for free without paying for Ancestry. So birth records. So typically the information found in a birth record is going to be given by one of the parents of the child or a medical professional. So usually a midwife or a doctor, depending on the time period and location of where this birth happened, if it happened at home or if it happened in a hospital. Or there might be another witness to the birth who files this information shortly after the birth happens, usually. The exception is there's going to be something called a delayed birth record. So these are records that are usually filed a significantly longer time after a birth happens. So years and years later. So even though in Wisconsin, for example, they didn't require them until 1907, well, at a certain time, people are like, hey, Social Security, I need Social Security. Well, I need to prove how old I am in order to be eligible for Social Security. So you're going to see a big boom in delayed birth records for those people after 1935 who are trying to get Social Security because they need to prove how old they are. If you file a delayed birth record, you have to prove your information. You have to prove your name, your birth date, your location, and the parents' names. So proof, it depends on every record. So they kind of might have several records that they bring, like a family Bible or a census record Or maybe they've got affidavits from a neighbor or the mother or the midwife who attended the birth or some other relative who would have known or who knows you, knows who your parents are, things like that. Unfortunately, even though you can look at delayed birth records, you don't get those kind of proof things that they included, which would have been awesome to have those proof things. Be aware though that these delayed records might be filed separately than the other birth records. So if you are looking in regular birth records and you don't find one for 1905, for example, look in those delayed birth records because they might be in there. Some records will specifically tell you who filed that record and when they filed it, which will help you kind of determine, okay, is this information probably more accurate than the neighbor down the street filing this information, or the midwife who, you know, hopefully she attended the birth and didn't attend 10 other births that day and then mix up the information. So you kind of, again, have to look at each little piece of data that you've got on each record and kind of look at everything with a grain of salt and find more information to prove and disprove this information. There's going to be two main formats to birth certificates or birth records. One is a certificate and one is a register. So the certificate is what we most commonly probably think of. It's one form issued by a state or a county, and it's one form per person. You're the only person on that birth record. Whereas the register, that's kind of like a 2-page thing usually, where it's going to list many births occurring over a certain time. So usually like days or maybe even months, depending on how many kids are born in that location during that time period. So you're going to have lots of births, and not everybody has their own page. Unfortunately, those registers are kind of more prone to error then, because it might have been a longer delay in reporting those. So again, maybe the midwife waits until she has 10 births or 20 births before she goes down to record them, because she's not going to go after every single one, especially if she's attending a lot of births, or if it's in a rural area and it's the winter months. I mean, think about having to get your horse and buggy in Wisconsin through the snow. You know, it's tough when there's not actual paved roads. There, of course, could be a certificate and a register style birth record for your ancestors, each with a little bit of different information. So you always want to try to get both if both exist. It might be a difference between one's a state record, maybe one's a county record, or maybe the county just recorded them 2 different ways. It really is going to vary depending on the location and the time period. So what's typically in a birth record? Of course, we kind of walk through that first example of what's in there. So basically the same information is what you're going to get. Typically date, place, sex, race, name, mother's name, father's name. Hopefully you're getting a maiden name of the mother. They will list the residence. Sometimes they're very vague and just like put the city or the town. Sometimes they put an actual address. Sometimes they're listed an occupation. Older records, of course, only ask for the fathers because at a time period when women weren't working outside of the home. And then sometimes you might also get the ages and birthplaces of the parents. So sometimes it might only ask for the father, or sometimes again, it might be vague where it says just the country or the state where they were born. And again, just a reminder, not all the details are always on every record. Each jurisdiction, each time period is going to have different levels of information, and it's going to depend on who's filing the record and what information they know. So even though it's typically found on birth records, doesn't mean all this information is guaranteed on every record. You might also find things like time of birth, a birth order, like they were 3rd, 4th, 5th child, name of the children born to that mother, and number of children still living. Some, like we saw that first example, might even show lists of actual names of the siblings. So helping you identify all the siblings. For those who died shortly after birth, sometimes you might not get their name listed there. Sometimes you might, but then you might only find a death record for that child and not necessarily a birth record, or you might just find a baptism record with a little notation or like a cross with a date on it that indicates that they died. So it's going to vary depending on who's recording that information, and there's lots of things to consider with children who died shortly after birth or were stillborn. You might also discover if your ancestor was a twin or a triplet or multiple, if it was a legitimate birth or not, and legitimate at this time period means that the parents are married. And then of course, who reported the birth, and sometimes the date it was reported or filed. And again, remember, any record can contain errors, so be sure to locate multiple sources for each fact to try to make sure you're doing a reasonably exhaustive research and trying to get the most accurate information possible. So now I'm going to show you some examples. So this is an example of a birth record. That's a certificate format that I've gotten for my great-grandfather. So you can see right away, name of child, it's blank.
Oh,
That's helpful. So you may get some unnamed children, and you have to use that indirect evidence to determine who this is actually about. Thankfully for me, the county clerk in Peoria County had a little sticky note that said, I know the name's blank on this, but in our index, it says it's Ralph. Well, that's who I assumed it was because I knew the date and location. You might also find the record might be amended, which is an official change that happens at a later date. So maybe 10 years later, the mom says, oh gosh, your birth record doesn't have your name on it. We need to get that changed so we can add your name. And then you'd find it like written in different ink. And then they usually make a notation of when that change happened and who was making that change. It's an official change that they have to do at a later date. Not all the time did they do it though. Unfortunately, this one was never amended, but thankfully I know from all the information who it is. So again, just like the other examples, you see kind of the same types of information that you find in this record are kind of the common things that you're going to find. And lucky for me, I also have a register style birth certificate for him as well. So if this is going to be across 2 pages, but you can see there's different information on this one compared to the certificate one. This one says Ralph. It is written in a different handwriting, so it might have been added later. I can also see that it doesn't say what date it was filed down here, but it does all the way up here. And then they kind of use these little quotation marks that might be hard to see. So that's why you always want to make sure to take a copy of the whole page if you're going to do a copy of something. So some differences that I saw between the certificate and register, it gives an exact address of where they lived on the certificate version. The first name doesn't appear on the register version, or the first name appears in the register version where it doesn't on the certificate one. There's different registration dates. So one's more recent than the other. And then there's more specific birth locations for the parents on the certificate version, whereas this one just lists Illinois, for example. But you kind of need to look at these headings and then kind of come down here to where your ancestor is to kind of piece together what information they're asking for, of course. And then here's that second page. So again, always be sure if it is 2 pages, you get both pages. And it right here, it lists who the medical attendant was. I don't want you to ignore that name, even though, of course, you're like, oh, it's just a medical attendant. What do I need to know that name for? It could also be a relative. So I have an example of an ancestor where it listed the medical attendant was Sarah Wheeler. Well, she was the town midwife, which I saw because she's listed on a bunch of different records in that county and in that town. But she was also the paternal grandmother of the person that she was overseeing that birth, who I was looking for, my ancestor. And so I was able to piece together that, you know, her grandmother attended her birth and was the midwife for her. So don't always ignore who that medical attendant is. Yeah.
Sidebar, I found a medical attendant and just on a whim Googled the name and the city and found out that she left her documents for the year of my great uncle's birth and
Wow.
found a page saying that he was born on some Missouri bottomland 4 miles southeast
Wow.
of the city, and it's really cool.
Yeah, so you never know. You might find that the midwife or the medical attendant donated their records or their diary to a local archive that you can then go search it in a library or an archive and learn more information than is on that record. So a great tip. I've got an international baptism record. So yes, international records can be found online. This one's from Germany, and this one's actually on Ancestry Library Edition that I got for free without having to pay for the world subscription of Ancestry. Again, don't forget to copy down the full page and all these headings so that you know what information should be in this box. Obviously, this is all in German. I don't really speak German. Thankfully, with the magic of Google Translate, I can kind of figure out what this means. And you can usually at least pick out the surname of your ancestor. And you might be able to pick out a couple certain words depending on what language it is. This one's obviously really hard to read, but it does feature the same amount of information or same types of information you would find in a US birth record, where it's got the name, the sex, the age, or the birth date, the parents' names and what their occupation was of the father, things like that. And it continues on a second page. It gives the date of birth. This one, since it's a baptism record, it also gives the date of the baptism and then the sponsors of the baptism as well as then the name of who's recording that information is there. My tip for you for transcribing and translating those international records. So first, if you find it online, it's really helpful to zoom in as far as possible on each of these little boxes and take a screenshot of each of those boxes, because the more you zoom in, the easier it is to determine, is that an M or an N or a W or what? So the more you zoom in, the easier it is to try to read what it says. And remember, of course, if you're transcribing it, so you're writing out what it says first in that language, and then you're going to take that transcription that you wrote out and then try to translate it. That's going to be what they call a derivative source. So again, if that terminology doesn't make sense to you, refer back to our talk last month where we talked about what a derivative source is, but essentially it's not the same as an original source. The original source would be this baptism record that's in a language that you don't know maybe, but then you're going to make a derivative source because you're going to translate it so that everybody who doesn't know German can now be able to read it. But because you might have made an error in transcribing it and translating it, it's not going to be an original. Again, just like on our US records, they sometimes make these ditto marks or they're put little lines and things. So you always, of course, want to make sure to take the whole page and look at the entries above to make sure that you're getting all the information that could be on the ancestor. Because if I just copied just his little part, I might be missing out on information then. That might have been a ditto of 2 entries above, for example. So where do I locate birth records? Well, again, first you want to figure out where your ancestor was born, as specific as possible, down to the county or city and town name. So look for clues in other records if you don't know down to that location. Look for their death record, their obituary, of course, not 100% accurate because of who the informant is, who's providing that information. Look at their marriage record. If they were in the military, do they have a military record, or is there a church record that you can find? So all these different other types of genealogy records might give you clues to that time period and that location. Of course, there's also census records, which we'll talk about more in depth next month, but those are usually going to be broader locations. Like it's going to list just Wisconsin and not what county in Wisconsin, or it's going to list Germany and not what state or what city. Some state censuses do list the county. So for example, I have ancestors who lived in New York, and there's the New York State Census, which I'll show you examples of and talk through more next month, but they list specifically what county that person was born in that state census. So sometimes you can get clues like that in state censuses. You had a question?
I do, military records, where do you find those?
We are going to have a whole session on military records.
Perfect, thank
Yes,
you.
so some you can find online, but the vast majority of military records are going to be offline, depending on what you're looking for, what conflict or what time they would have served.
Do they have to go through the US government, or are there some local also?
Sometimes, yes, there are local ones. Like I was able to get a separation form for my great-grandfather, showing his time in the Navy, when he enlisted, all that stuff from the local veterans office.
Thank you.
Sometimes there's also state offices, so we're dive deeper into that when we do military
That's
records.
fine.
My parents lived in one location, very small town, close to Waupaca, but I was born in New London Hospital. We never lived in New London, but if somebody asked me where I was born, it would be best to say Waupaca County.
Yeah. So
Okay.
typically when I put them in my family tree, I'm putting that city or town name, then the county name, and then the state, and then the country.
And
so-
the city is where the hospital, or where they actually were.
Where that hospital would have been. Yeah, because that's actually where you were born, not necessarily where you were living.
Okay.
Where you were.
Yeah, okay, I see.
In birth records, if there is an adoption, is the original birth record ever released again?
Adoption records are tricky because each state has their own law. So Wisconsin is a completely closed state where that original birth record you cannot get access to, even if it is about you. So adoption records, it's going to depend on the state and what their laws are. So again, with adoption records, I would go through the Family Search Wiki, see what access is like in that given location. So again, what if you don't have a county or a city name? Keep searching for those clues. Again, go back to, remember we were searching for clues. Remember last month I showed you what's called the ultimate record checklist. Refer back to that. Have I checked in all of these different records to see if it lists a city name or a county name for my ancestor in any of these records? And don't forget about your collateral ancestors. So those are, again, the siblings or other relatives that are not your direct line ancestors. They could be the key, because remember, maybe a birth record doesn't exist for my great-great-grandfather, but his brother's got a birth record and it lists where in Germany the family's from. So don't forget about those outside ancestors that are not your direct line ancestors, because it can help you break through all the information you need to find that specific town in Germany where all the records are held then on your family. You of course also need to know when your ancestor was born, as close to a full date as possible. But even a year or a year range is going to be better than nothing when you're starting to search for that birth record. So again, look for clues in those other records first. If you do find your ancestor in the 1900 census, and we're going to talk again all about the census next month, the 1900 census is unique in that it gives a birth month and a birth year, but don't worry, it might be off a little bit. I found usually the month is accurate, but sometimes the year might be off. Maybe you can calculate their birth based off the age at death. So somebody had shared earlier that, if it gives an exact year, month, and number of days that they were alive, you can use an online calculator to try to calculate an approximate date that they were born then. Or you can try to figure out based on their age at another event. So how old were they when they married, and then do the math in your head, or how old were they when their child was born, do the math in your head, or use a calculator to figure out an approximate time period. So again, where do you locate those birth records? You're going to find out first when the state began recording those vital records, and then where those records are held. Records are usually going to be held at the city or county level. So for example, in Wisconsin, they're held at the Register of Deeds office for that given county. So Outagamie County, for example, our Register of Deeds office is in Appleton. Wisconsin vital records also have all the records held at Madison as well in our state records office. But again, every state, every location is going to be different depending on how they do it. It's not common to have many birth certificates before the 19th century, or sometimes even to the 20th century, because before then it wasn't legally required. But again, it's going to depend on the location. Before then, it's more typical to find baptism records. So those are looking at those church records we're going to talk about in a couple months. That might be your good alternatives to finding a birth record. The exception to that is New England states, because those are some of the earliest states that began recording those births. And those date back sometimes to the 1600s. So if your ancestors were in New England before they came to the Midwest or elsewhere in the United States, you might find luck in New England records. Again, a reminder, even if your state didn't require them at a time your ancestor would have been born, or you still want to check, because you might get lucky. Even if it's like 20 years before they legally were required, you still might find records. So don't be afraid to check. If you can't find a birth record, there's going to be all kinds of alternatives. So I've got a whole listing for you because we're running already short on time. I'm just going to let you guys read through that in your handout. It's not a complete list, but this is an idea of where you can search for alternative records if you can't locate a birth record. Do we got any questions on birth records before we move on to marriage records? Any questions? All right. So now we're going to move on to marriage records. So here I've got an example of an 1876 marriage in Wisconsin. So again, Wisconsin didn't require marriage records until 1907. My maybe third great grandparents were married in 1876, and I've got this super detailed marriage record for them. So again, don't be afraid to check. Even if it wasn't legally required, you might get lucky. So again, just like the birth records, it's got lots of information. It's got date of when it was registered, the color of the people being married, the full name of the husband, the full name of the wife, including her maiden name, occupation of the husband, where the husband lived, birthplace of said husband. It says Schleswig-Holstein, which is an area in Germany and was also part of Denmark at a certain time. So now I have a little bit more concrete information other than just Germany. I've got the place, the town, and the county where the marriage was conducted. I've got the time when the marriage was conducted, which just has the date. But what type of ceremony? It usually just says religious. I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen anything other than religious listed there. It's got the name of the people or the person who conducted the marriage. So I have this reverend's name, and then I can look in a city directory for this location and see maybe what church he was affiliated to try to figure out what church my ancestors went to and where I might be able to find some church records. So don't ignore that clue of that person's name. I've got the residence of where that person lived. I've got the names of witnesses. Again, these are usually going to be people that are related. So this is a brother and this is a father. The husband, a brother to the bride. I've got the date of the certificate of the marriage. I've got the name of the father and the mother. Unfortunately, for the mother of the husband, it does not list her maiden name. But then I've got the father and mother of the wife, and it does list a maiden name for her. So this is pretty far back in 1876 to have all this level of detail of information. And again, I found that for free on the Ancestry Library Edition. It didn't cost me anything. So marriage records, thankfully, tend to be the most accurate of our vital records because a couple is usually standing in front of the person giving the information about themselves. And they're usually recorded pretty close to when the marriage happened. So it's going to be the most accurate, hopefully. Hopefully you know that information about yourself, that you would be giving that information to somebody. Marriage records also tend to go the furthest back because it's legally binding two people together. So even before that was legally required to record a marriage, people were recording it because, again, you're tying yourself to somebody for life. Unfortunately, many of the older marriage records do contain some sparse information, but you might get lucky. You might get some names of the parents, of the groom and bride. So it's really going to depend on the level of detail each record is going to give you. Again, look for church records because that might be where you're going to find the very old records, and especially those international records for marriages. And again, look for that church record even if you do find an actual vital record because you might get some more detailed information. Just like with births, marriages can be found in certificate or register format. In some locations and time periods, marriages were actually a three-part process, meaning you want to track down all three of these documents if your ancestor lived in a place that followed this. So the three-part process is kind of more common in the South and mid-Atlantic states and some international countries. So the three-part process, and I'm going to show you examples of what each of these look like in just a second. The first step was they had to file a marriage bond or a marriage ban, and I'm going to walk you through what each of that means in just a second. Then they had to complete a marriage license, and then they went and got married, and then they were given a marriage return or a marriage certificate after that marriage actually happened. And so if you, at first you're like, okay, I need to figure out how the marriages were conducted in a given location, again, you're going to start with that Family Search Wiki. So that's the easiest spot to figure out what the marriage process was like, what records are available, what time periods, and where to get them either online or offline. You're going to start with that Family Search Wiki and search Illinois Vital Records or Wisconsin Vital Records or Ireland Civil Registration. Again, just like I showed you earlier. And again, it's going to help you where to locate those offline records because again, not everything is online. So here's that example of what a marriage bond or a marriage ban looks like. This is a marriage bond. So essentially what the couple has to do is they have to list that they are intending to get married. And this has really fun old English language in here that kind of walks you through, you know, this person is this age, that they're legally able to get married, they intend to marry so-and-so, and they had to kind of sometimes publish this somewhere so that other people could see it. It's kind of that speak now or forever hold your peace part of a marriage ceremony that people could say, no, I object to this marriage because she was promised to me or whatever, which is crazy to think about. But just because a bond or a ban was filed doesn't mean a marriage actually happened because people can object to it or marriages fall through, it happens. So you might find this and then not find the second or third part of the marriage, meaning it didn't happen. The next part, again, is that marriage license. So the couple is going to fill out this information prior to them getting married, and then they file it with the proper office. It usually is giving some kind of statistical information like their name, how old they are, what their residence is, their color, their birthplace, sometimes very vague, sometimes very specific. occupation, parents' names, things like that. So lots of helpful information that's going to give us clues. So if you do have an ancestor who had to fill out a marriage license, that's a really key piece. But again, just because that marriage license was filed doesn't mean that a marriage actually took place. You need to follow up and get the actual certificate. Sometimes it's on the same page. So you can see up here, it's the marriage license. And then down here, it's the certificate of marriage. So you can see the marriage actually took place on this date by this person, for example. And we've got, sometimes you get like witnesses of who attended that marriage and things like that. Sometimes it's a separate page though. Sometimes the license and a certificate are on two different pages. So here's an example of a separate just marriage certificate where it doesn't have the marriage license on it, even though it does say marriage license on it. It is technically a certificate because this is showing this couple who are this age got married on this date by this person. So again, this is what gets filed after they actually legally get married. Some have very detailed information, kind of similar to that marriage license. Other, it's just vague. Like I just got the names and ages of these people. I don't have their parents' names or anything like that. I've got information on where they were married and what date they were married. That's it. That's all that's featured on this one. But maybe on their marriage license, it has that parents' information, et cetera, et cetera. And again, there might be additional records, such as a church record, where I could get some more additional details. Yeah.
I had this with, my relatives in New England, where when I went on my ancestor family search and brought up their marriage certificate, record, whatever, and it just listed the groom, bride, groom, where they're from and everything. And then I happened to accidentally get the arrow to the right, and I got the back side of that page,
Yes.
and that had the parents.
Yes, so always, no matter if you're looking at a record in person or online, go a page before or a page after, because you might get lucky and find additional information. And it might just not be on one page, it might be on multiple pages. So don't be afraid to go back and forth, either forward or the next page. So here is an example of a marriage return. So again, this is similar to what we just looked at, where after they get married, they get this. And again, notice the amount of information for this record, which is from Washington, is different from the one we just looked at in Illinois. This one's very vague. This one's more detailed, where it gives the parents what number of marriage this was, their birthplace, all this occupation, all this information. And actually, this record that we're looking at is from 1913, and the other one's from 1930. So again, time period, location, everything is going to look different. And the level of detail is going to be different depending on where you're searching. Here's an example of a marriage register style, and I'm going to go into family search so you can see it a little bit easier. This one's tough. So again, registers again are usually 2 pages. So thankfully, when you look at them online, it's really awesome to just be able to zoom in and zoom out. So you can zoom into who you're looking for. You'd have to scroll up to see what information it's giving in these boxes, but you can see, again, you've got the husband and wife's name, you've got their ages, their birthplaces, where they resided, what their occupation was, their parents' names, all kinds of information, what date they were married. Again, you're going to get ditto marks and things, so that's why you always want to look at what the records are above, making sure you're taking a copy of the whole entire page, looking at the witnesses, who married them, and following up on that information. So again, you'd want to take a look at what these headings are and what your actual record is for the people you're looking at. And again, those are usually 2 pages long, so don't miss both pages. Usually when you're finding them on Family Search especially, they have both the pages scanned as one, so you don't have to go back and forth to see the second page usually. And then I've got an example of an older marriage record that's all in paragraph format and very hard to read given the handwriting. So some, like the international records or some church records even, you might get in this paragraph format and you gotta, really zoom in to try to be able to read it. So this one's from 1832, so it's pretty early. And as with other formats, the amount of information is going to vary depending on where they're located, where the marriage is happening. I've got another example of an early marriage that's very, very difficult to read. So this is actually multiple marriages. I know it's very, very hard to read. It's even hard to read when you zoom in, but it basically just lists the husband, the wife, and what date they were married. No other additional information. But this marriage is from 1778, so you can still get very, very early information. This is from Massachusetts. So again, one of the New England states are, you might get a lot more records, but sometimes they're going to be sparse in the information. And then I've got an international one. So again, you're going to get various formats, but usually they have them in the register format where you're going to have to zoom in and try to figure out what it says, but it's going to give the same amount of information, like what the date was, the name of the couple, including the names of the parents, usually, where they were from, what date they were married, how old they were, things like that. My pro tip for you, especially with international records, but it works with any type of record, if you find it and it looks really bad on one website, try to find it on another website. So for example, I found this marriage record on Ancestry first, and it was really, really difficult to read because it was scanned in black and white. It was really hard to read. I could kind of make things out, but then I went and found it on Archeon, which is a German church record site. That's a paid subscription site, but it's beautiful in color and it's so much clearer of a scan. So it was so much worth it for me to pay for a subscription for a month to be able to get a copy of this record where I could actually read it. Once I figured out the German, of course. So I always do that too. If I find a census record on Family Search, for example, and it's really difficult to read, I try to find it on Ancestry and see if it's better or vice versa. So try that with other records as well. Of course, where do you locate marriage records? Very similar to birth records. You need that date or the range and location. You want to check those existing records for your clues. So again, obituary, census records, there's going to be some of them that ask how many years a couple has been married. So either the 1900 census or the 1910 census. The 1930 census asks what age they were first married. So be aware, people might have been married more than once. So you need to take that into consideration if you're looking at that information, the 1930 census. And then the 1850s to the 1860 or 1880 census is going to ask if that person's been married within the year. It'll have just a little tick mark. And again, we'll dive deeper into the censuses next month. But many states thankfully have indexes for their marriage records that cover certain years. So again, start with that Family Search Wiki for that location. So for example, it's going to link you to, when you look at the Wisconsin ones, it says Wisconsin, there's a database from 1820 to 2004 on Ancestry. But be aware that's a little misleading because many of the years it's only an index and not the actual record. So you're not going to be able to go on there and get a marriage record from 2000 on there. It's just going to be an index. And it sometimes doesn't always cover all of the locations in that state. So be careful. Sometimes they're a little misleading. But for this database specifically, you're going to get some pre-1907 records. So if they were married or born or died before that time period, look in that database. Again, remember, not everything is online. You need to follow up with offline stuff to get copies of that original record. And again, Family Search Wiki will direct you to where to go offline to get those records and where those records are held. If you can't find a record you think should be there, with marriages, there are sometimes separate indexes for the bride and separate indexes for the groom. So be sure to check both, because the bride might be under a different surname than what you anticipate her being under. So maybe she had been married before and she's remarrying under that first husband's name, or maybe she reverted back to her maiden name, or maybe this is her third or fourth marriage and you didn't know that. Also, of course, be aware of crossing borders to be married. So sometimes there are certain counties and states that had different laws, like the age of consent and how old you had to be to get married. Or maybe they just eloped because, for whatever reason. They call these Gretna Greens. It's like an old Scottish term, but there's a whole listing that I have linked for you in your handout, and it's also on Family Search Wiki that shows you all the common Gretna Green locations in the United States. It's got it all mapped out, so you can kind of see based on what state they would have been in, maybe what the closest one was, or it's got a whole listing. Like if your ancestor was from Illinois, check Crown Point, Indiana, because that was a popular Gretna Green for people who were living in Illinois at that time, for example. For Wisconsin, I always encourage you to check Michigan records, because a lot of times people went up to the UP to get married, or they went down to Chicago. So if you are not finding your Wisconsin ancestors in Wisconsin marriage records, check those two locations definitely. Again, what's typically in a marriage record, it's going to vary based on details depending on time period, and everything can contain records. I've got the whole listing in your handout, and since we're so short on time already, I'm just going to breeze through this and let you read it on your own. If you can't locate a marriage record, I've got some alternative records for you. Again, this is not a complete list, but some ideas for you, like finding church records, looking for newspapers. They've got anniversary articles sometimes, and even sometimes photos of people on their like 70th anniversary or 50th anniversary, which is really awesome. Sometimes they've even got side-by-side photos of a photo of them when they got married and then a photo of them on their 50th anniversary, which is awesome to find. Maybe you're gonna find family Bible, or they've got a commemorative wedding certificate, or you got a wedding invitation that was saved, or a dated wedding photo, or there's a divorce record, or they were married again and had to list that information on their previous marriage, things like that. If there was a divorce, there's of course going to be records for that. As with other vital records, it's going to depend on the location and time period of where to find it and what level of detail. Again, start with Family Search Wiki. It's found in the same spot as the vital records. So if you scroll down further, it's going to have a spot for divorces. Most records for divorces are going to be housed at an office with the vital records, or with the court records, or at an archives. It again depends on the different states, what time period we're looking at. Usually the older records are kind of shipped off-site somewhere to an archive, for example. It's more rare to find divorce records online at this point, so you're going to be needing to do some digging offline or request records offline to find these, but they're very worth it because they're very detailed usually. So you might be able to find a nice index for divorces online, and then it's going to point you to where to find the actual full record, and then you're going to want to follow up and get that full record from that place offline. For older records, usually one of the parties, whoever was requesting the divorce, had to prove why they wanted a divorce or why they had to have a divorce, like abuse, neglect, they were deserted, things like that. So be aware, sometimes those details are hard to read, but we also don't know the accuracy of them because, again, it's one person's word against another. If you really want a divorce, you're going to lie, I'm sure. Think about, did they have a reason to lie in order to get this divorce? For Wisconsin specifically, our older ones are held at area research centers, which are held at the four-year UW colleges around the state. And I've got a link for you in the handout that shows you where all those four-year ones are. And for example, like UW Green Bay, it contains all the counties around Green Bay. So like Outagamie County is at UW Green Bay, for example. So the map of Wisconsin will show you what specific area research center to go to for that county. There's also a divorce index for a certain time period on Family Search and Ancestry Library Edition, or Ancestry if you have a subscription. And they've got a divorce records database on Ancestry or on Ancestry Library Edition, but it just gives an index of the names, the divorce date, and that place. And that date range is very misleading because it's not a complete collection. Because it says it covers 1907 to 2015, but my parents were divorced in 2000 and they're not in here. So it's not complete. So just be aware of that. So this is the map I was just talking about where it shows you where the UW college is. So by the star, and then what states surrounding it based on the color of where you can find it. So for example, like I said, Outagamie County is at UW Green Bay. At UW Oshkosh, you're going to find Winnebago, Fond du Lac, Dodge, et cetera, et cetera. So you can find all pre-1907 vital records housed there, as well as at the Register of Deeds office for Wisconsin. They've also got lots of other older records like court records, naturalization records, things like that. Here's an example divorce record that I found on Ancestry. So this is just a very vague divorce record listing the names of the parties, when and where they were married, what date they filed to divorce, and then what the reason was, if the divorce was granted, how many kids there were, and then on the back side it lists the kids and their ages. So always be sure to check to see if there's 2 pages. There's likely going to be a more formal divorce record in the court records. So I would want to take this information then and follow up offline to get that full divorce record to read more details on this divorce. Questions on marriages and divorces? I know we are going way over time. Any site where I can download a marriage record that's written in Italian where it might be translated, I would start with Family Search Wiki. Family Search Wiki has some good translation tools, and they've even got like certain genealogy words based on what language it is. So you can search like German word list or Italian word list on Family Search and get a word list of what it is in English and then what it is in that foreign language. So again, Family Search Wiki is an awesome resource. Questions from you guys? We've got death records on, you know, we've got 5 minutes left and it's not gonna happen. All right, so this is death records. So here's an example of a Wisconsin death record from 1902. So again, the level of detail depends. We've got the name of the deceased. If it was a woman, they would have hopefully listed her maiden name, or if she was a widow. Color and sex, race, occupation, age. It's got that year, month, and date. So if I've got that information, it didn't list what his birth date was, I could try to use a calculator to try to figure out an approximate birth date. Got the name and birthplace of the father, name and birthplace of the mother. Unfortunately, doesn't give a maiden name of the mother. I've got a birthplace, unfortunately not very detailed of where in Germany. I've got the date of birth. I've got their marital status, the name of the wife or husband if they were deceased. So I've got their spouse, the date that they died, their cause of death, how long they had that disease, their place of death, where they lived at the time, if they were ever a US soldier or sailor, the name of the physician, coroner, or justice, the residence of that person, the name of the undertaker or person who conducted the burial, number and date of that burial permit, the place of burial, which usually lists that cemetery where they're buried, that date of this certificate and the date they registered it, and then other important facts. So again, very good level of detail for 1902, and this was before Wisconsin required vital records. So these are unfortunately typically the least accurate of the vital records, because again, the person the record is about is not providing that information because they're dead. So it's only as good as who is providing that information, and that person's called the informant. But as we just saw in that example, sometimes it doesn't list who the informant was. So then nowhere in that listing did it say who provided that information. We don't know, was it his spouse? Was it his brother, his sister, one of his kids? Was it the next door neighbor? Who was it? We have no clue. So again, take each piece of data on there with a grain of salt, find some additional data, additional sources that you can compare that data to prove and disprove things. Of course, on the records that do list who the informant was, if it's a close family member, it's likely to be more accurate, of course, than if it was a neighbor or, you know, a friend or something. But that's not always 100% guarantee, because again, even family members can misremember information or knowingly sometimes give false information. You never know. Again, always find more than one source for each fact. If the informant is not somebody who you know, try to find out who they were. You know, it doesn't always list who they were and what their relationship was to that person. It could have been a neighbor, could have been a friend, could have been an in-law, it could have been the hospital or an undertaker. So research that person a little bit. The death information that's on there, like what date they died, what they died from, that's more accurate, of course, because that medical professional is providing that data. But that birth information, who the parent or the spouse was of that person, that's going to be information that somebody else is providing. So that's information that we want to, you know, find additional records to prove or disprove that information. Just like the other records, it can be certificate or register style for death records as well. Again, like I mentioned earlier, many genealogists start with a death record and work their way back, since it's typically going to be listing a birth date and a location and the spouse or the name of the parents. Even if that information might not be 100% correct, it at least gives you a starting point of where to go. So use those as hints to follow up and find some proof of those before you accept it as fact. There's also going to be fewer restrictions for death records usually than birth records or marriage records. So some places unfortunately restrict access to certain records if it hasn't been a certain time period. So for example, for birth records, some locations say you can't view this birth record unless it's been 100 years, or you can't view that marriage record unless it's been 50 years. Whereas death records, even the places that restrict them, sometimes it only has to be about 25 years before it's open to the public, or sometimes less. Again, it's going to depend on the different locations and what their restrictions are. Sometimes they might restrict certain pieces of information. So for example, they might say, you can look at this record, but you can't see the cause of death or the address of where they lived before they died, things like that. It again depends on the different locations and what their laws are at that time. Or if they scan certain pieces of death records, they might block out certain pieces that they don't want publicly accessible on Family Search or on Ancestry. So here's an example of a certificate. So sometimes you get information that's typed and it's so much easier to read, or they might have a mixture. So you've got some handwritten stuff in here, some typed information. We don't know, is the typed information all coming from one person and then the handwritten stuff's coming from somebody else or vice versa? Or is it all coming from this one person? We don't know, unfortunately. So again, we're going to take each piece of data and then find additional information to confirm or deny this. But you can see what level of detail, like where they died, where they usually lived, marital status, age, all that kind of fun stuff, who their spouse was, their birth date, birthplace, occupation, parents' names, who the informant was, where they were buried, cause of death, date of death is going to be over here. If there was an autopsy or some other investigation into their death, you're going to find that data in here. And then all the medical kind of attendant, undertaker stuff is going to be down here, or when that information was filed, things like that, when they were buried, all kinds of details in here. And then of course we've got register style. So this one is from 1887 in New York. So again, just like the other registers, we've got the headings up here that we want to look at, and then we have to look at our record down here to see what kind of detail it gives. And this one was only a 9-day-old child. So you do sometimes find death records for those babies who didn't live very long after they died. And again, those registers are going to be on 2 pages. So you're going to want to, again, find that second page and then see what kind of level of information they've got. Sometimes it's all filled in, sometimes it's not. So like this whole column was not filled in. It's the time from attack until death. So if they had a certain disease or something, it might have said like when they started having that disease and then when they died, but whoever was filling it in didn't fill it in for anybody on this register form. We've also got international death records, of course. So again, they're going to be usually the register style or that paragraph style, where you're going to get that information. And again, zoom in very far on some of these international ones and get the headings, of course, to be able to see what information is in each box, to be able to transcribe it and translate it. Just like the other vital records, you need a date, an exact date, a range, or even a year, and a location of where that death happened. So to get some clues, look at that obituary, either for that person or for their spouse. Sometimes a spouse's obituary will list an exact date of when their spouse died. Their tombstone might have a year of death or an exact date of death. Find a Grave is a free website of burials all around the world where you might be able to find a listing for your ancestor. Billion Graves is a similar site where you can find grave sites from all around the world with some of that data extracted. There might be cemetery records, which we're going to talk about more in depth in the future. But if you know exactly where somebody is buried, follow up and see if that cemetery office has any records that might have some additional details for you. Some states have their own death index. So again, start with Family Search Wiki to see if there's any available online indexes for that state. Check genealogy sites, of course, like Family Search, Ancestry, or any statewide, county-wide, or country-specific resources for indexed records. Sometimes they even have digitized records. Some examples include Illinois. So they have a statewide index through one of their state sites that covers 1916 to 1950. So if you have an ancestor who died in that location during that time period, search for their name, and then you can get an exact date of death and then find out what location, and then you can write to that location for that actual original record. So again, you always want to be sure, even if you do have an index, to follow up and get the original record whenever you can, if it's not available online, because it's going to give you a lot more information than just the index. Again, I've got a whole listing of what you typically find in a death record that you can go through in your handout. Again, not every detail is going to be on every record. It's going to depend. There's going to be errors. You got to follow up and get more sources with every fact. And then if you can't locate a death record, there's lots of other alternative records that you can find. Again, not a complete listing. So I've got a whole list of things for you. Some things I just want to point out. Gravestones, even if it's written in stone, it's not 100% correct. So I found lots of gravestones with errors on them. There's something called the Social Security Death Index that is available to search online. The majority of the people featured in here are people who died from 1962 to 2005, but it does cover some deaths before that time or after that time as well. It's people, of course, who are eligible for Social Security. So you're not going to find your ancestors who were from the 16 and 1700s in this. There's wills or probate, so we're going to talk more about that later this year. There's mortality schedules, which are special censuses for people who died within those years, and we're going to talk more about those next month. If it was an unusual death, there might be some sort of coroner's report or an autopsy that you might be able to find on that person. If you're still not sure exactly when they died and you can't find a record based on the little bit of data that you have, try to narrow down a death year or a range by looking at things like city directories or census records or tax records to see when is my ancestor here and then when can I not find them? And then think, okay, did they move or are they not there because they died? And then try to, again, use some investigative skills, dig into any available records, use that ultimate records checklist to see, have I looked at every record that possibly could exist on my ancestor to see if I can find any more details that might help me narrow down a time, place, all that kind of stuff. Starting to lose my voice, but we're almost done. That's right. Let's see. Anyone know about vital records for Virginia? Again, I would start with the Family Search Wiki, always. Yeah, Michigan restricted records for 75 years, so things like that. If there's a number circled on the death record, that number will tell you what the person died from. Yes, so sometimes there's a certain like little coded number in that cause of death. So even if the cause of death sometimes is blocked, you might be able to use that code and search it online and find the little answer key that will give you what the cause of death was, or if you have trouble making out what that word is, because usually it's some complicated medical terminology, just Google what it is or Google that code and get that information. So here is just a quick example of why you always want to get the original record. So this is what the index looks like for this person. Index is a derivative source, so it's not the original source. It's a source that's made from an original source. So I only have the name, that she was female, what date she died, what place she died, and what her spouse's name was on the index. But if you follow up and get the original record, which was also on Family Search, thankfully, look at the level of detail I get on this record. I get all these things like where she lived, an exact address. I've got, unfortunately, it doesn't list her birth date, but if it did, it would be there. If she was a veteran or not, all this kind of stuff. It's got parents' names. Unfortunately, for this person, it's unknown. It's got who the informant was, where she was buried, when she was buried, what the cause of death was, all this kind of detailed information that you don't get in the index, where I only got 3 or 4 pieces of data from the index, but I get all types of data from the original record, which is why you always try to find it. Sometimes you get lucky and it'll be online. Sometimes you have to pay for it or search for it offline. So just quickly, I want to talk about how to access them and how they might be accessible for us genealogists. So most vital records are accessible to the public for certain years, but it's going to depend, again, on the jurisdiction's laws. So like somebody said, 75 years for Michigan records. Some places they're 100 years or 25 years, or some they're freely open no matter what year. Some records might be digitized and put online on the genealogy sites. Some are only available offline. Each state, each country is different. Even counties within states are sometimes different or handle things differently. So some might only allow access if it's been a certain year, or others might have their records freely available to search. Some you might need to make an appointment to search in that place, or you have to, provide an ID, fill out a researcher's form if you're going to a Register of Deeds office. Some have digitized all their records, but you have to go into their office to access them on a computer. So if you know, for example, Outagamie County, everything's on one computer at Outagamie County, and you have to type in their name. You don't just look through the actual books to find a physical certificate anymore. They've digitized everything. So you should probably know that before you go research there. If you're like, I'm not very tech savvy at all, you wouldn't want to know that kind of information. Others, they might have microfilmed their records and you need to use a microfilm machine in order to access it, or you have to use these big old dusty books. Or, some places you have to request and pay for each record and wait for them to be mailed to you. So a couple years ago, I went to Illinois. I have a lot of ancestors in Peoria County, and I went to the courthouse. I was all excited to start researching. And they said, oh, you can't go back there and research. You have to fill out a form for each person and pay us $5 for each copy. So I went home and empty-handed and filled out a bunch of certificates when I got home. But it was like, well, that was kind of a waste to drive all the way to Peoria County and then not be able to look at those records. So you want to find out that information before you go make a research trip and spend 6 hours driving somewhere to look at records to find out you can't, you have to pay for it, and you have to request it by mail. So some places offer like a cheap genealogy copy, but sometimes even $5 if you've got 100 people to look up is not cheap after a while. So be aware. And then other places like Wisconsin, $20 no matter what. Unfortunately, every state again makes up their own rules, makes up their own costs of how much things cost. So again, start with that Family Search Wiki every time. Be aware, of course, laws change. So just because something was publicly accessible online or publicly accessible in the courthouse 5 to 10 years ago, doesn't mean it still is today or will always be. So things change all the time. 20 years ago when I first started researching, I could look at all the causes of deaths and look at all the records in Wisconsin, but now they block off some of that information because the law has changed. Some states will allow you to access restricted records if you can prove that you are a direct descendant of that person and prove that relationship, or prove that you have a tangible interest in it, even if it's your great uncle or something. If you're not a direct descendant, but you have a family connection. Again, not everything is online. You might have to do more offline research, depending on where you're searching, what time period, all that fun stuff. So ways to research offline, you can either try to visit it in person if you're able to. You can try to write or call for records and have to pay for them usually. You can hire a local person or a genealogist to look at that record or get that record for you, depending again where it is. Like I hired a researcher in Germany. I can't just hop on a plane and I don't know German in order to properly research. So I hired somebody who knows German, who is in that location to get those records for me. So again, it really depends on your level of comfort, your budget, how comfortable you are with technology or figuring these things out. If you're not tech savvy and you're like, I have no clue if this stuff's offline or online or how to even navigate that Family Search Wiki, you can book a one-on-one appointment with me or sit down with you and go through it with you. Or we do have certain technology help hours at the library where one of our awesome volunteers will sit with you one-on-one and show you where to click and where to go for certain things. You can look at our events calendar for when those technology help hours are offered. Or of course, my business card is here. You can reach out to me to book me specifically. Then for the US, again, different counties and cities are typically the record holders for vital records, but some states also collected them, or there might be statewide indexes. So again, each state's different. Wisconsin, again, everything's held at Register of Deeds office, but there's also the State Vital Records office in Madison where you can get all of the Wisconsin records as well. Internationally, and even some US states, some vital records are online. The ones that are online are on Family Search, which is available for free, Ancestry.com, which you can pay for a subscription to, or you can come to the library for free. You can even bring your own computer and look at a subset of Ancestry records for free using the library edition. There's also some other paid genealogy sites that some records might be on. Again, it's going to vary depending on who put them online and where they put them online. Other places might have their own websites where they want you to search for and pay for those records. So for example, I have ancestors who got married in Washoe County, Nevada, and I found out they have a website. I can search their index and I can buy the record right there. And then shortly after I buy it, you get a copy of it right there. So again, it depends, no matter where you're searching, it's going to vary every single time. You might even find international vital records offline or online. Again, it's going to depend on location, the time period, what the access laws are. Usually you're going to find more church records for international people online than anything. Again, start with Family Search Wiki to find out what the access is like, what restrictions there are, where you can get them online, or where to write offline to get those records. If you still aren't sure, be sure to contact somebody locally. So start with a library or a genealogy society in that area that you're searching for. So if you're not sure, hey, where's the library in Peoria County, Illinois? Where's the nearest one? Is there a genealogy society? You're going to go to Google and you're going to type in libraries near that city and state, or same with the genealogy society, or give us a call at the library. We'll search that information for you. So again, you can type in libraries near Green Bay, Wisconsin. And then I'm going to see a listing of all the libraries near here, and I can see a little map too. And then I could see their phone number and just give them a call and say, hey, do you guys have these records, or how do I get records for this area? Because they're going to be the local experts if you're trying to find Peoria County, Illinois, or Jasper County, Iowa. I don't know that off the top of my head. I would start with the Family Search Wiki, or I would refer you to the library or genealogy society there. And again, we can also help you locate the nearest library and their phone number if you're not tech savvy. So definitely feel free to give us a call or come visit us at the library. Even if it's trying to find a number of a library out of the state, we're happy to help you find that information. Cost is going to vary widely depending on where you're getting it from. You should have free access to look at the records and transcribe them in person, especially for Wisconsin. But again, this is going to be derivative source because it's you looking at an original source and then writing down. Well, you could write down things a little differently or miss some data in there. So that's why it's a derivative source, not original source. Some places might charge you a research fee to search there, or you have parking costs or costs to travel there. If you want to photocopy something, that's going to cost you. So for example, $20 for each record in Wisconsin. Other states, sometimes it's less than that. Sometimes it's more than that. Again, every place is different. It's important to determine where's the best place for you to access the records you need and want, keeping in mind what your research goals are, what your access limitations are for how you can access those records, what your budget is, your willingness to travel, or your tech savviness, or ability to hire a researcher. So think about, okay, do I have records to look up in 10 different Wisconsin counties? Well, does it make sense for me to go to all 10 different counties around the state? Or does it make more sense for me to take a half day to drive to Madison and go look up all those 10 records? Obviously, it makes a little bit more sense for us to drive 2 hours to Madison to look up all those records instead of paying 10 counties $20 or driving to 10 different counties in the state. So think about things like that. Or think, oh, I need 2 death records from California. Well, it makes more sense for me to order them over the mail and pay for them that way than, booking a trip to California, paying for a ticket, paying for lodging, paying for a car to get there, all that kind of stuff. Or can I find records online that will be good enough instead of me having to pay the expensive fee to buy these records from California, for example? Can I find an obituary instead of a death record that's going to be cheaper, and maybe I can find it online through newspapers.com instead of paying for a death record, for example? Again, you got to make that own determination for yourself. There might be multiple ways to access the same record. Again, costs and restrictions are going to be varying depending on the repository or what website you get it from. So for example, there's so many different ways to get a Appleton 1900 birth record. I can get it from the Register of Deeds office in Appleton. I can get it from UW Green Bay's Area Research Center in Green Bay. I can go to the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison. I can go to the Vital Records office in Madison. I can get it for free on Ancestry, either the library edition, or if I have a paid subscription, I can get it there. Again, there's going to be varying costs depending on what way I'm accessing it and how I want to access it, if I want an actual copy or if I'm just fine transcribing it, for example. I'm so going over time, I'm so sorry. So some tips on accessing those on-site records. Research that location first. So again, don't drive all the way to Peoria, Illinois and find out you can't get records. That'll drive you nuts. So search their website first to see when are they open, what are the restrictions, how do I access things. Most places have a genealogy section or an FAQ section where they might have information on how to do genealogy research there. Again, if you're not tech savvy, give us a call at APL or come visit us. We'll help you get that information in order to call that place or look up where you need to go and give you that information. Always call that location in advance before you go there. Verify any information you find on their website because things could have changed. Maybe they're gonna be closed on the day you plan on going there to research. Call and access information, call and ask them information, like, do you guys have electronic access to your records, or do you have a microfilm machine, or where do I park, or what can I bring in there? Can I bring my phone in there? Can I bring my purse in there? Can I bring pens? You know, every place is gonna have different rules and how to access there. And again, some places might have digitized their records or microfilmed them. So for example, I know Outagamie County, all on their computer, you have to be there to look it up. Oconto County, everything's on microfilm, and their microfilm machine's kind of old and difficult to read those vital records, but that's how you access their records. That's the only way, unless I go to Madison to access them. Make sure to bring your photo ID, some paper, some forms that you want to print, some pencils, some coins for parking. Again, each repository is going to have their own rules. Sometimes you have to walk through a security check before you can be allowed in there. Make sure you have a list of names, some dates, some ranges, so you know what you're looking for, and not just saying, oh, I'm going to look up all my Johnson ancestors and spend all day there looking for Johnsons. So you don't want to browse through 100+ years of records for one surname or two surnames. You want to have an idea of who you're looking for. Don't forget to write down where you got that record. So where did you get it? What the volume number, what the page number was, any information you need to be able to find that record again, or to cite your source, of course, because we want to prove that this is where we got that information from, so that we can access that information again, or prove to other people our genealogy is good stuff. I personally have created my own little research form. So whenever I go to a Register of Deeds office or someplace where I'm going to get birth, marriage, and death records, I have these little forms that I make copies of. And then I can just quickly write what I read in the book and then keep going on to the next one. So you can create your own like this, or there's something called a research extract form that's for free on Family Search that you can use to kind of fill in this common information that you're going to find in those birth, marriage, and death records. And then quickly, I've got some demonstrations on how to find vital records on Family Search and Ancestry. I know I've gone so over time, so thank you everyone for holding in here. So Family Search, we're going to go to familysearch.org, click on search, and go to records. So there's kind of 3 different ways to search in Family Search. You can fill in this big box right here with the name of your ancestor and that kind of information, or you can find it by a collection name. So I can type in birth, and I can see, oh, there's Alabama, there's Arkansas, there's Arizona, all these kinds of places. And I can click on that one and search just within that one. Or I can put marriages in there, I can put deaths in there, et cetera, et cetera. Or I can search by place. So I can type in Germany over here. I can type in Wisconsin. It's going to be a specific country or state. And then if I scroll down here, I can see what specific locations or what specific collections there are for that location. So I can see German births and baptisms for a certain time period, and I would click in it and then be able to get into that search bar so that I'm just searching in this one collection. Or again, I can do that big name search over here. So I can type in my ancestor's name. So right here, it just asks for place or year, but you're like, okay, what do I put in there? Birth year, their death year? Well, click on more options first, and then you can click on one of these options, like their birth, their marriage, or their death. So if I'm looking for a death record, I know she died in Illinois. So I click on Illinois. I know she died 1922. You can put in a couple year range if you don't know the exact year, or you only have a 5-year time period, you can put that in there and then click search. And then you can see it's going to give you some results. So see right here, I've got a find a grave page. I've got a death and burial page that I can click on. It's first going to give me an index. So this is information that somebody has pulled out. So that's the index. But again, I want the original record. Thankfully, they've got one over here that says check image and availability. And it says I have to access the site at a Family Search Center or a Family Search affiliate library. Thankfully, Appleton Public Library is a Family Search affiliate library. So I've got this magical tool on my computer. Unfortunately, I can't give it all to you, but I've got this magical tool that tells my computer I'm actually in the library, even though a second, and then I should be able to click on it in order to pull it up. So this would be like you were in the library, and if you click on it, it's going to take a second here before it recognizes I'm in the library, even though I'm not.
So it would recognize us if we were in the.
If you're in the library, yes. But if you're from home, it's going to give you that error. Come on, you know you want to work, please. Let me go back in it like that and see if it recognizes it finally. Okay, it's being difficult. Maybe in a second it will work. But usually then you could click on it and it would pull up that actual record, or there's other records that are just here that you could click on. And like, for example, you can see there's a little camera icon. This one's a census record, for example, but if it was a vital record, you could click on the camera and it would bring you right into that actual record. So just pretend this is a birth, marriage, or death record instead of a census record. You could view it right in here. You can zoom in and zoom out over here using these tools or on your mouse. You can download it right here. So maybe now if I go back to that birth, marriage, death record, I can get into it now that it's taken a second to hopefully, nope, it still is being difficult, unfortunately.
And so then when that census form came up, we could actually print that if we were sitting.
Yeah. Well, Family Search you can access from home, except for there's a certain subset you can only access at an affiliate library, which is Appleton Public Library, or a Family Search Center, which we have one. Is it Pinehurst, I think it is, or that's Pinehurst is Green Bay. Park Ridge is at Appleton. So they're open limited hours, like 4 hours a week or 8 hours a week.
So we could print documents there though, with the limited, okay, very good, thank you.
But a good chunk of Family Search records are available for free from home. I'm not sure if this is going to work either, because Ancestry Library Edition is again one that you can only access in the library. But we're seeing, maybe my computer will cooperate. If I go to apl.org, I click on eLibrary. So this is how you would navigate to it when you're in the library. You click on Ancestry Library Edition. And again, you can only access it in the library. Thankfully, it finally is working. So see, it thinks I'm in the library now. So what I could do is I could start searching right here. I can click begin searching, and I could start filling in some data on my ancestors if I wanted to. How I personally like to search though is through the card catalog. So if you click on search and click on card catalog, this is going to bring you to similar, like a library catalog, where you could click on all these little filters over here. So say I just wanted to look at vital records. I can click on where it says birth, marriage, and death records. I can even put in a title or a keyword. So say I just want Wisconsin. I can put Wisconsin, if I could type Wisconsin, in keywords and click search. And now it's going to narrow down to just ones that are Wisconsin. And I can see there's marriage records, there's death records, there's birth records. So for example, I want to click in these birth records. And now I'm just searching in this one collection for Wisconsin. So I'm going to type in my ancestor's name. I'm going to type in her birth. Maybe I just want to put the year. I can put the location if I want to, or I can just put in that information because maybe this is all I know, and click search. Now I can see, oh, I've got somebody listed here that looks like it could be the right birth date and location. Now I can click on view record and I see there's like a little image right there. So here's that birth record that we first looked at way at the beginning of our talk, where I've got my ancestor here. I can click save right up here. I can send the image home, so it's going to ask for my email address, or I can save it to this computer and then I could print it from there if I wanted to. Or this little wrench icon also works to download or print from here. So I've got some additional details for you on Wisconsin vital records if you've got some Wisconsin ancestors. Our next session, Tuesday, March 26th at 1 p.m. on census records. In the meantime, we're going to have our Find Your Ancestors genealogy session on finding what you need and making the most of it on March 9th at 2 p.m. That's what I've got for you. Again, don't forget our YouTube channel if you've missed our past sessions, or for all those people who had to leave early because I went way over, you can find the recording of this on our YouTube channel. So I can show you quickly if you go to youtube.com/APLREF. If you click on playlists, there's a playlist for genealogy series for seniors. So in a couple hours, I'll have this video from today up there, but you would just click on view full playlist. You can see our first video from last month is on there and you just click on it to start watching it. There's also one for Find Your Ancestors down here. So if you miss any of our past Find Your Ancestors, some of them are recorded and put on there as well.
What's that website again?
This is youtube.com/APLREF. I've got it right here on the screen for you.
I used the, family search, and I had my grandfather, and then I was able to click his father's name.
Mhm.
Through.
Yeah, so there's family trees on there on Family Search. So again,
I
anybody
found
can
out I'm
edit that.
related To one of, I don't know how many greats back, but an uncle is Daniel Boone.
Oh,
from
cool.
Kentucky.
Yeah. Again, you want to verify all that information on there though, because
And
some
yeah, it
people.
was through the
Yeah.
family search
Mhm.
that I found, I thought that was.
Yeah. Mhm. Any questions you guys got?
I have that.
Handout for the session, from the last session.
I don't have copies from the last one, but you can send me an email and I can send you a copy.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you've got my business card there. Just send me an email and our get you. I had a sign up sheet, I don't know where it went, for our newsletter. So every month I send a newsletter out. Okay, she's got it back there. Every month I send out a local history and genealogy newsletter that talks about our upcoming programs. I usually include like a tip every month on how to use our genealogy databases. I've got some cool local history information. If you want to, you can put your name and email address on that sheet and I'll sign you up. The March issue will be coming out in a few days. Any electronic people or virtual people, you can also sign up for that through our website. See if we've got any questions here, if anybody's still hanging in here. All of our stuff here. All right. You can use International Death Codes Index. It's online. So that's again, if there's a little number on your cause of death, you can use that. If a doctor wrote over on the death certificate, is there a way to see the back side of the death certificate? It depends on if it's online or not. If it's online, obviously use the next page and see if it's there. Sometimes they didn't always scan in that back side. So you might need to go offline in order to find that actual death record. How do you find a genealogist in another country to do searches for you? I would go to the Association of Professional Genealogists. So Association of Professional Genealogists is a great website called appgen.org. They've got a little find a professional area where they've got a directory. So if you're looking to hire somebody either internationally or in the United States, this is the directory here. You can put in a certain research country right here. So if you're looking for someone in Germany, for example, I can put in Germany in there and then click search. And then it's going to give me people who will do research in Germany. They might not necessarily live in Germany though. Like you can see this guy lives in France, that guy's in Switzerland. He's going to be more expensive to hire to go to Germany. So I might want to find one that's actually in Germany, or this one's in Utah. Well, they're not going to be searching. They might search German records, but they won't search them in Germany. So you'd click on each person's profile, learn a little bit about them and what they might specialize in. What else we got here? Find recommendations for foreign country genealogists. Join Facebook groups. Yes, they've got lots of Facebook groups for international people as well. Some people have great recommendations in those groups. Who classifications for diseases for death codes? There's a link in there. Can we get a copy of the death information sheet you made? Sure, I can send that to you guys. I've got birth ones and marriage ones as well. I just used an Excel or Word spreadsheet. Thanks for that person who put the AppGen link in there for you. Any other questions in person or virtual? It's so hard to navigate both audiences. Thanks everybody for holding in here. I appreciate it.